In the final year of the Second World War, while American cities prepared for invasion scenarios that never came and the Pacific War raged across islands thousands of miles away, Japan launched one of the strangest and least known attacks in military history. It did not involve submarines landing saboteurs, aircraft bombing cities, or soldiers storming beaches. Instead, Japan attempted to weaponize the atmosphere itself, carried silently by the jet stream. Thousands of unmanned balloon bombs drifted across the Pacific Ocean with the intention of striking the American mainland. For the only time during World War II, the continental United States would come under direct enemy attack, not by soldiers, but by the wind. The idea behind Japan's balloon bomb campaign emerged from desperation. By late 1943, Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated rapidly. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered devastating losses at Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippine Sea. American submarines were strangling Japan's shipping lanes, cutting off oil and raw materials. The once feared Japanese air arm was being steadily destroyed by superior American aircraft and pilot training. Conventional means of striking the United States directly were no longer feasible. Japan had neither the aircraft range nor the naval strength to conduct sustained attacks on North America. Yet Japanese military planners remained determined to bring the war to American soil, both to damage infrastructure and, perhaps more importantly, to shake civilian morale. The solution came from an unlikely source: meteorology. Japanese scientists had identified the existence of a high-altitude air current flowing eastward across the Pacific, what would later be widely known as the jet stream. This fast-moving current, discovered through weather balloon experiments, could theoretically carry objects from Japan to North America in just a few days. If a weapon could be designed light enough and stable enough to survive the journey, it could bypass the entire American naval and air defense network. No pilot would be required. No ship would be detected. The weapon would simply ride the wind. From this idea emerged the Fugo balloon bomb program. The name came from the Japanese words for weapon and number, reflecting its experimental nature. The balloons themselves were remarkable pieces of engineering, constructed primarily from handmade washi paper, reinforced with glue derived from the konjac plant. Each balloon measured roughly 33 feet in diameter. Hydrogen gas provided lift. Suspended beneath the balloon was a payload consisting of incendiary devices and, in some cases, an anti-personnel bomb. The total weight was carefully calculated to allow the balloon to reach an altitude of approximately 30,000 to 38,000 feet, where the jet stream flowed strongest. One of the most ingenious elements of the design was its automatic altitude control system. As the balloon crossed the Pacific, it would inevitably lose hydrogen gas and descend. To counter this, Japanese engineers installed a mechanism that released sandbags one by one whenever the balloon dropped below a certain altitude. If the balloon climbed too high and risked bursting, a valve would vent hydrogen gas. This cycle allowed the balloon to maintain altitude for several days, theoretically long enough to reach North America. Once all sandbags were released, the payload would be dropped, detonating over American territory, and the final charge would destroy the balloon itself to prevent capture. The primary intended targets were the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest. Japanese planners hoped that incendiary bombs would ignite massive wildfires, diverting American manpower and resources away from the war effort. There was also a psychological component. The idea that enemy weapons could drift unseen into American cities or wilderness areas was expected to create fear and uncertainty among civilians. Some Japanese strategists even hoped that panic would force the United States to divert air defense assets away from the Pacific and Europe. The first balloon bombs were launched in November 1944. From launch sites along Japan's eastern coast, thousands of balloons were released into the sky. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 9,000 and 10,000 balloons were launched over the course of the program. The Japanese military closely monitored weather patterns and timed releases to coincide with favorable jet stream conditions. Once launched, however, the balloons were entirely at the mercy of the atmosphere. There was no way to steer them, no way to control where they would land, and no way to know whether they reached their targets. Within weeks, the first balloon bombs began arriving in North America. Some were discovered in remote forests, tangled in trees, or resting quietly in snow-covered fields. Others detonated on impact, leaving craters or scattered debris. Balloon bombs were found in states including Washington, Oregon, California, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, Michigan, and even as far east as Iowa. One balloon reportedly reached northern Mexico, and another was discovered in Canada. The geographic spread demonstrated that the concept worked. The jet stream could indeed deliver weapons across an ocean. Yet, despite this technical success, the campaign failed to achieve its intended effect. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was unusually wet in the Pacific Northwest, greatly reducing the risk of forest fires. Most balloons landed harmlessly in uninhabited areas. Some failed to detonate at all. Others were discovered by civilians or authorities before causing damage. The American government quickly realized the potential danger, but also recognized that widespread publicity could amplify the psychological effect Japan sought to create. As a result, U.S. authorities implemented a near-total media blackout. Newspapers were asked not to report balloon bomb incidents, and radio broadcasts avoided mentioning them altogether. The strategy was simple: deny Japan feedback. If Japanese planners believed the balloons were ineffective or never reaching America, they might abandon the program. For months, the public knew almost nothing about the strange objects occasionally found in forests or fields. Military teams quietly recovered unexploded devices, studied their construction, and disposed of them safely. Despite the secrecy, tragedy was not entirely avoided. In May 1945, near Bly, Oregon, a balloon bomb detonated after being disturbed by civilians, killing 6 people, including 5 children and a pregnant woman. It was the only fatal enemy attack on the U.S. mainland during World War II. The incident underscored the unpredictable danger of the weapons and reinforced the government's decision to keep information tightly controlled. By the spring of 1945, Japanese launches declined. The lack of visible results, combined with increasing Allied bombing of Japan and the collapse of the country's industrial base, led to the quiet termination of the program. When the war ended later that year, most Americans remained unaware that thousands of enemy weapons had crossed the Pacific and landed on their soil. The balloon bomb campaign remains one of the most bizarre episodes of World War II, a fusion of science, desperation, and psychological warfare. It demonstrated both the ingenuity of Japanese engineers and the limits of technology when divorced from reliable intelligence and control. While the balloons failed to change the course of the war, they succeeded in achieving something no other Axis weapon did: reaching the American mainland and killing civilians far from any battlefield. By late 1944, the Japanese balloon bomb program moved from theory and testing into full operational deployment, becoming one of the most unusual long-range weapons campaigns ever attempted. The project, officially known as Fugo, relied on a deep understanding of high-altitude atmospheric currents that Japanese meteorologists had studied for years. These scientists had identified a powerful winter jet stream flowing eastward across the Pacific at altitudes of roughly 30,000 to 38,000 feet, capable of carrying objects from Japan to North America in as little as 3 to 5 days. The Japanese High Command believed this natural conveyor belt could deliver weapons to the American mainland without risking aircraft or submarines, which were increasingly vulnerable to Allied interception. The balloon itself was an engineering compromise driven by scarcity. Japan lacked sufficient rubber supplies to produce thousands of large latex balloons, so engineers turned to washi paper made from mulberry bark. This paper was lightweight, strong, and flexible, but it had to be glued together by hand using a paste derived from konjac root. Much of this labor was carried out by schoolgirls and women conscripted into war production, working in freezing factories under strict secrecy. Each balloon consisted of hundreds of overlapping paper panels carefully sealed to prevent hydrogen leakage. Even with these precautions, the balloons were fragile, vulnerable to weather, and unpredictable once launched. Each Fugo balloon was approximately 33 feet in diameter when fully inflated with hydrogen gas. Beneath the balloon hung a complex control system designed to maintain altitude during the trans-Pacific journey. As the balloon rose during daylight hours, expanding gas would cause it to climb too high and risk rupture. To prevent this, a pressure valve released hydrogen automatically. At night, when temperatures dropped and the balloon descended, an ingenious ballast system activated. Sandbags attached to a rotating ring were dropped one by one to regain altitude. This cycle repeated over several days, allowing the balloon to ride the jet stream until it reached North America. Once the ballast was exhausted, the balloon entered its final phase. A fuse triggered the release of its payload, which typically consisted of one 15-kilogram high-explosive anti-personnel bomb and several smaller incendiary devices. After deployment, a self-destruct charge destroyed the balloon's remaining structure, intended to conceal its origin and prevent technical analysis. In theory, this final phase would scatter fires across American forests, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, where dry timberlands were believed to be highly vulnerable. The first operational launches began in November 1944 from multiple sites along Japan's eastern coast. Launch crews worked at night to avoid detection by American reconnaissance aircraft. Balloons were released in batches of several dozen at a time, carried silently into the upper atmosphere, and then swept eastward. Japanese planners hoped that by releasing thousands of balloons over several months, enough would survive the journey to overwhelm American firefighting resources and create widespread panic. There was also hope that the psychological impact of unexplained explosions on American soil would undermine civilian morale and force the United States to divert military resources away from the Pacific Front. By December 1944, American radar stations along the West Coast began detecting unidentified high-altitude objects drifting inland. At first, these contacts were dismissed as weather anomalies or equipment malfunctions. The United States had no expectation that Japan possessed the capability to strike the mainland with aerial weapons, especially weapons that left no obvious launch platform. When fragments of strange paper, wires, and sandbags began turning up in rural areas, military intelligence struggled to determine their origin. The first confirmed balloon bomb explosion occurred near Thermopolis, Wyoming, in early December 1944, when an object detonated after landing. Over the following weeks, similar discoveries were reported across Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, and even as far east as Michigan. Some balloons fell harmlessly, snagged in trees, or collapsing in open fields. Others ignited small fires or detonated upon impact. Fortunately for the United States, winter conditions, rain, snow, and frozen ground dramatically reduced the effectiveness of the incendiary devices. The massive forest fires Japanese planners had envisioned never materialized. Despite the limited physical damage, the U.S. government took the threat seriously. The War Department, the FBI, and the Office of Censorship quickly coordinated a strict information blackout. Newspapers and radio stations were instructed not to report balloon bomb incidents. The goal was to deny Japan any feedback on whether the weapons were reaching their targets. If Japanese analysts believed the campaign was failing, they might abandon it altogether. This silence was remarkably effective. While rumors circulated locally, the vast majority of Americans remained unaware that enemy weapons were landing on U.S. soil. Behind the scenes, American scientists and military engineers worked to analyze recovered balloon debris. Once enough intact components were recovered, they were able to trace the sand ballast to specific beaches in Japan based on mineral composition. This provided conclusive proof of the balloon's origin and confirmed the jet stream theory. While impressed by the ingenuity of the design, U.S. analysts also concluded that the weapon posed no strategic threat. The balloons were too inaccurate, too dependent on weather, and too limited in payload to influence the war's outcome. Nevertheless, the psychological danger remained. Military leaders feared that public knowledge of the attacks could spark panic, especially if exaggerated by rumors or enemy propaganda. Civil defense authorities quietly prepared local law enforcement, forestry services, and utility companies to respond to unexploded devices. Citizens were encouraged, without explanation, to report strange debris and avoid touching unfamiliar objects. Fighter aircraft were even dispatched on several occasions to intercept balloons visually, but their high altitude and passive drift made interception impractical. By early 1945, balloon bomb sightings had increased as Japanese launch rates peaked. It is estimated that more than 9,000 balloons were released, though only about 300 were confirmed to have reached North America. Many likely fell into the Pacific Ocean, ruptured at altitude, or landed in remote wilderness areas where they were never discovered. From a purely military standpoint, the campaign was an expensive gamble that delivered little tangible effect. Yet the danger of the Fugo balloons would not fully reveal itself until the spring of 1945, when one balloon bomb produced the only known civilian casualties from enemy action on the U.S. mainland during World War II. That event would permanently define the legacy of Japan's balloon bomb invasion and demonstrate that even the most unconventional weapons could carry tragic consequences. By late 1944 and early 1945, the Japanese balloon bomb campaign had quietly reached its operational peak, even as Japan itself was being pushed toward collapse. Thousands of Fugo balloons had already been released into the upper atmosphere, riding the powerful jet stream across the Pacific Ocean toward North America. Most never reached land. Many burst over the ocean, malfunctioned, or came down in remote wilderness areas without being detected. But a small and unpredictable percentage did reach the continental United States and Canada, scattering silent weapons across forests, mountains, deserts, and farmland. American authorities quickly realized that the balloons presented a unique and deeply unsettling challenge. Unlike conventional air raids, the Fugo attacks offered no warning sirens, no visible enemy aircraft, and no predictable targets. A balloon might drift for days, even weeks, before descending at an unknown location, Some landed intact, others detonated on impact, and still others hung silently in trees or power lines, their explosive charges waiting for the slightest disturbance. The psychological dimension of the threat was far greater than its actual military damage. The idea that a weapon launched from Japan could strike American soil without interception deeply disturbed both civilians and military planners. The U.S. government responded with an unusually strict information blackout. The Office of Censorship ordered newspapers, radio stations, and local authorities not to report balloon sightings, explosions, or casualties. The strategy was deliberate. Japanese planners were relying on American press reports to judge the effectiveness of the Fugo program. If no reports appeared, Japanese leaders might assume the balloons were failing and abandon the effort. Editors across the western United States reluctantly complied, suppressing stories even when unexploded bombs were found near towns or when explosions occurred in populated areas. This decision meant that many Americans living near balloon landing sites had no idea what the strange silk objects or metal debris actually were. Behind the scenes, U.S. military units scrambled to track and neutralize the threat. Army Air Force's aircraft were dispatched to intercept balloons when spotted. Though the extreme altitude and vast search areas made interception difficult. Fighter pilots reported occasional successes, shooting down balloons over the Pacific coast or inland skies. But the effort consumed time and fuel that could otherwise be used for training or combat preparation. Ground units were tasked with investigating crash sites, disarming unexploded devices, and recovering balloon fragments for intelligence analysis. Each discovery provided more insight into Japanese manufacturing methods, materials, and deployment techniques. Despite the secrecy, the balloon bombs did cause real damage. Forest fires were ignited in remote areas of Oregon, Washington, California, and British Columbia. Most were quickly extinguished due to wet winter conditions, but fire crews reported strange debris near ignition points. In some cases, balloon remnants were found tangled in power lines, causing blackouts. One balloon struck near a nuclear facility at Hanford, Washington, briefly disrupting power to the site involved in producing plutonium for the Manhattan Project. Although no lasting damage occurred, the incident underscored the unpredictable danger posed by the Fugo campaign. The most tragic incident occurred on May 5, 1945, near Bly, Oregon. A group of children and a pregnant woman were on a church outing in the forest when they encountered what appeared to be a downed balloon. When the device was disturbed, it exploded, killing 6 people instantly. They became the only known fatalities caused by enemy action on the continental United States during World War II. The U.S. government, maintaining its censorship policy, limited public reporting of the incident, though the truth would eventually become known after the war. The event demonstrated that while the balloon bombs were largely ineffective as weapons of mass destruction, they were still deadly. Japanese leaders, meanwhile, monitored the situation from across the Pacific with growing uncertainty. The lack of American press coverage was interpreted by some as evidence that the balloons were missing their targets or falling harmlessly into the ocean. Others suspected that the Americans were deliberately suppressing information. Internal Japanese reports showed mixed assessments, with some scientists insisting the concept was sound, while military commanders grew increasingly skeptical. By early 1945, Japan's industrial base was under relentless attack from American bombers. Raw materials were scarce, and resources were being diverted toward desperate defensive measures closer to home. As the balloon campaign continued, its strategic relevance diminished. The Japanese hoped that forest fires would force the U.S. to divert manpower and resources away from the Pacific theater. But this never happened. The fires were too small, too scattered, and too easily contained. Civilian morale in the United States remained largely unaffected, partly because the public knew so little about the attacks. The psychological shock Japan had hoped to achieve never materialized on a national scale. By April 1945, with American forces closing in on Okinawa and the air war over Japan reaching catastrophic levels, the Fugo program was quietly wound down. Balloon production slowed, then stopped altogether. The last launches occurred just weeks before the end of the war. In total, Japan is believed to have launched around 9,000 balloon bombs, of which approximately 300 were confirmed to have reached North America. The true number may never be known, as many landed unnoticed in remote regions or were destroyed without documentation. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, American authorities began lifting the censorship restrictions. Newspapers finally reported the existence of the balloon bomb campaign, and the public learned that enemy weapons had been drifting silently over the continent for months. For many Americans, the revelation was startling. The idea that the war had physically reached their homeland without their knowledge challenged the assumption of continental invulnerability that had defined much of the American wartime experience. In the years that followed, remnants of Fugo balloons continued to be discovered. Hikers, loggers, farmers, and children occasionally stumbled upon decaying silk envelopes, corroded metal components, or unexploded ordnance. The U.S. Forest Service and local authorities issued warnings, reminding the public that these devices were still dangerous decades after the war. Even into the 21st century, unexploded balloon bombs have been found and safely detonated by bomb disposal units, a lingering reminder of a forgotten front of World War II. The Fugo campaign ultimately failed in its strategic objectives, but it remains one of the most unusual and audacious weapons programs of the war. It represented an early attempt at intercontinental attack using atmospheric science rather than aircraft or missiles. Though crude by modern standards, the balloons foreshadowed later concepts of long-range delivery systems and psychological warfare. More importantly, they revealed how desperation and innovation could combine to produce weapons that were as unsettling as they were ineffective. What remains most striking about the balloon bomb invasion is not the damage it caused, but how close it came to something far worse. Had weather conditions been different, had censorship failed, or had a balloon detonated in a major city, the historical memory of the Fugo campaign might be very different. Instead, it exists today as a quiet, almost surreal chapter of World War II history, a reminder that even the most powerful nations can be touched by war in unexpected and invisible ways. By early 1945, American authorities had a disturbing realization. Japan had found a way to strike the continental United States directly, repeatedly, and almost invisibly. Although the physical damage caused by the balloon bombs was limited, the psychological implications were enormous. The United States had entered World War II believing its oceans provided an impenetrable shield. The Fugo campaign shattered that assumption, even if quietly and without public acknowledgement. What made the situation more unsettling was that the weapons continued to arrive sporadically and unpredictably, carried by winds that could not be controlled or accurately forecasted by either side. From November 1944 through the spring of 1945, American military and civilian agencies tracked balloon bomb incidents across a vast geographic area. Devices were recovered or detonated in at least 16 states, as well as in Western Canada and northern Mexico. Some were found tangled in trees or power lines. Others were discovered by hikers, farmers, or railroad workers who had no idea what they were looking at. A few caused forest fires. Though winter weather and damp conditions prevented the catastrophic blazes Japanese planners had hoped for, several balloons drifted into remote areas and detonated harmlessly, leaving behind fragments of paper, sandbags, and metal fittings that puzzled those who encountered them. The U.S. Army and the Federal Bureau of Investigation quickly recognized that widespread public knowledge of the balloon bombs could produce panic, encourage copycat fears, and potentially validate Japanese hopes of psychological disruption. In January 1945, the Office of Censorship issued a sweeping and unusual order to American newspapers and radio broadcasters. All reports of balloon bombs were to be suppressed entirely. Editors were instructed not to mention explosions, recovered devices, unexplained fires, or strange debris if there was any possibility it related to enemy balloons. The policy relied not on enforcement, but on voluntary compliance, and remarkably, it worked. Almost all major media outlets cooperated, creating an information blackout that left the American public largely unaware that the country was under direct attack. Behind the scenes, however, the response was intense. Army units were dispatched to investigate each incident, collecting fragments and mapping impact sites. Scientists analyzed the construction materials and quickly confirmed the balloon's Japanese origin. The paper was traced to mulberry fibers traditionally used in Japanese washi paper. The sand ballast matched geological samples from beaches along the Japanese coast. Engineers studied the altitude control mechanisms and were impressed by their ingenuity. Although the weapons were crude compared to conventional bombs, the system demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of atmospheric science and long-distance delivery. The U.S. military also began deploying countermeasures. Fighter aircraft were placed on alert along the West Coast, though intercepting the balloons proved extremely difficult. Flying at high altitude and drifting silently, the balloons were nearly invisible to radar and often passed overhead undetected. When spotted visually, they were difficult to engage, and destroying them risked detonating the payload mid-air over populated areas. As a result, interception was only partially effective. The majority of balloons that reached North America did so unopposed. Local authorities were quietly briefed on how to handle unexploded devices. Forest Service personnel were instructed to watch for unusual fires. Power companies were warned after several balloons caused short circuits by tangling in transmission lines. Military patrols monitored remote regions, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, where most balloons were believed to land. Yet the vastness of the territory meant that many devices simply disappeared without trace, either detonating unnoticed or decaying in wilderness areas. Despite the censorship, the balloon bombs did claim American lives. On May 5, 1945, near Bly, Oregon, a pregnant woman named Elsie Mitchell and 5 children were killed when they encountered a balloon bomb while on a church picnic. The group had discovered the device in a wooded area, and when it was disturbed, it exploded. It remains the only known instance of civilians killed by enemy action on the U.S. mainland during World War II. The tragedy was quietly reported without mentioning its Japanese origin, in accordance with censorship rules, and the public never learned the true cause until after the war. The deaths deeply troubled American officials, reinforcing the fear that public awareness might lead to more casualties. Authorities worried that curiosity-driven civilians, especially children, might attempt to touch or investigate unexploded devices if they knew such weapons existed. As a result, the censorship policy remained in place until Japan's surrender, even as balloon bombs continued to arrive sporadically. In total, approximately 300 Fugo balloons are confirmed to have reached North America, though estimates suggest the actual number may have been higher. Meanwhile, in Japan, the situation unfolded very differently. Japanese military planners monitored American radio broadcasts for signs that the balloon campaign was having an effect. At first, they heard nothing, which they interpreted as success. They believed the silence meant the Americans were suppressing news to hide damage and panic. Encouraged, they continued the launches through early 1945, even as Japan's industrial capacity collapsed under American bombing. Resources were diverted to balloon production at a time when food shortages and infrastructure breakdowns were crippling the home front. Eventually, Japanese intelligence officers began to suspect the truth. The absence of American reporting likely meant the balloons were not achieving the devastating results hoped for. Internal reports acknowledged that fires were rare and that the weapons lacked accuracy. By April 1945, as U.S. forces closed in on Okinawa and prepared for a potential invasion of the Japanese home islands, the Fugo program was quietly abandoned. The final balloons were launched in April, and the project faded into obscurity amid the far greater destruction being inflicted on Japan by conventional bombing and soon atomic weapons. In the United States, knowledge of the balloon bombs remained classified or forgotten for decades. Many recovered devices were stored in military archives or destroyed. Some fragments ended up in museums, mislabeled or overlooked. In remote wilderness areas, unexploded ordnance remained hidden, occasionally resurfacing years later. As late as the 1970s and 1980s, hikers and loggers occasionally stumbled upon remnants of balloon bombs, prompting renewed warnings about unexploded World War II munitions. What made the Fugo campaign uniquely unsettling was not its immediate impact, but what it represented. It was the first time an intercontinental weapon had been used to attack another nation using natural forces as a delivery system. Decades before intercontinental ballistic missiles, Japan had demonstrated that geography alone could no longer guarantee safety. The balloon bombs were primitive, unreliable, and strategically ineffective, yet they foreshadowed a future in which distance would no longer protect civilian populations from war. As the war ended and attention shifted to post-war reconstruction, the Fugo balloons slipped into obscurity, overshadowed by atomic bombs, carrier battles, and amphibious invasions. But for a brief and largely hidden moment, Japan had managed to turn the winds themselves into a weapon, silently sending explosives across an ocean to a continent that believed itself untouchable. The psychological implications of that achievement would linger long after the balloons themselves had fallen from the sky. By the spring of 1945, Japan's balloon bomb campaign had quietly collapsed, not because it had been decisively defeated by American countermeasures, but because it had failed to produce the psychological shock its designers had hoped for. Between November 1944 and April 1945, more than 9,000 Fugo balloons had been launched from the Japanese home islands, riding the jet stream across the Pacific Ocean toward North America. Only a fraction reached the continent, and an even smaller number detonated as intended. Yet despite the technical audacity of the program and the unprecedented fact that enemy weapons had reached the American mainland, the campaign ended not with panic or retaliation, but with near total silence. That silence was not accidental. From the moment the first balloon was discovered in Alaska in late 1944, the U.S. government moved quickly to suppress public knowledge of the attacks. Military leaders feared that if Japan learned the balloons were reaching American soil, it would encourage further launches and potentially lead to more lethal designs. As a result, the Office of Censorship issued strict directives to newspapers, radio stations, and wire services, ordering them not to report on any balloon sightings, explosions, or recoveries. Editors were instructed to treat the subject as non-existent. Local officials who encountered debris were told to cooperate with the Army and remain silent. Even firefighters responding to suspicious forest blazes were often unaware of their true cause. This information blackout proved devastatingly effective. Japanese scientists and military planners had no reliable way of knowing whether their weapons were successful. They monitored American radio traffic and newspapers closely, expecting reports of explosions, fires, or civilian casualties. When nothing appeared, many within the Japanese High Command concluded that the balloons were failing to reach North America at all. Some believed the devices were falling harmlessly into the ocean. Others suspected that American defenses were intercepting them en route. The truth, that the balloons were reaching the continent but being deliberately concealed, remained unknown in Tokyo. The lack of feedback undermined the program's continuation. Resources in late-war Japan were scarce, and industrial capacity was collapsing under American bombing. Hydrogen production was limited. Trained personnel were being reassigned, and raw materials such as silk and paper were increasingly difficult to obtain. Without evidence of success, the Fugo project lost priority. In April 1945, with American forces closing in on Okinawa and the home islands bracing for invasion, balloon launches ceased entirely. Only one Fugo attack caused confirmed American civilian deaths. On May 5, 1945, near Bly, Oregon, a group of 6 people, 5 children and a pregnant woman, were killed when they encountered a balloon bomb while on a church picnic. The device detonated when it was disturbed, producing a blast powerful enough to kill everyone nearby. It remains the only instance in World War II in which enemy action killed civilians on the continental United States. The tragedy shocked local authorities, but the censorship order remained in effect. Even this incident was not widely reported until after the war ended. American military officials continued to recover balloon remnants throughout 1945, scattered across vast areas of the United States and Canada. Finds were reported in Washington, Oregon, California, Idaho, Montana, Utah, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Michigan, and as far east as New York. In Canada, balloons were found in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. Some were intact, having failed to detonate. Others were partially burned, tangled in trees, or embedded in snow. Ordnance teams carefully dismantled the devices, documenting their construction and analyzing their components. What American investigators discovered impressed them. The balloon system was crude in appearance, but sophisticated in concept. The use of the jet stream for transoceanic delivery was a remarkable application of atmospheric science, especially given Japan's limited resources late in the war. The ballast control mechanism, which released sandbags at timed intervals to maintain altitude, demonstrated a level of engineering ingenuity not widely recognized at the time. U.S. analysts concluded that the Fugo program had been far more advanced than initially assumed, even if its strategic impact was negligible. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, censorship restrictions were lifted, and the story of the balloon bombs finally entered public awareness. Newspapers published photographs of recovered devices, diagrams explaining their operation, and accounts of how they had crossed the Pacific undetected. For many Americans, the revelation came as a surprise. The idea that Japan had successfully attacked the U.S. mainland without aircraft, submarines, or missiles, challenged long-held assumptions about the nation's wartime invulnerability. Yet the balloon bomb story quickly faded from public consciousness. Overshadowed by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the liberation of concentration camps, and the sheer scale of the war's destruction, the Fugo campaign seemed like a historical footnote. It did not fit neatly into narratives of heroic defense or decisive victory. It was neither a triumphant success nor a catastrophic failure. Instead, it occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, a technically impressive effort that caused little damage, claimed few lives, and was neutralized largely by silence rather than force. In the decades that followed, occasional discoveries reminded the public of the forgotten campaign. Unexploded balloon bombs were found by hikers, loggers, construction crews, and children playing in remote areas. As late as the 1950s and 1960s, ordnance disposal teams were called to safely detonate devices that had lain dormant for years. Even into the 21st century, occasional finds prompted renewed warnings from authorities about the possibility of unexploded wartime ordnance in rural regions of the Pacific Northwest. Historians later re-examined the Fugo campaign through the lens of psychological warfare. Japanese planners had hoped not only to cause physical destruction, but also to sow fear and uncertainty among the American population. Forest fires, mass evacuations, and sensational headlines were expected outcomes. Instead, American censorship deprived the campaign of its psychological effect. Without publicity, there was no panic. Without panic, the weapon lost its purpose. In this sense, the balloon bombs represent one of the rare cases in modern warfare where silence proved more effective than counterfire. The campaign also stands as a precursor to later forms of asymmetric warfare. The concept of delivering weapons across vast distances without risking pilots or ships foreshadowed the development of intercontinental missiles, unmanned delivery systems, and long-range psychological operations. Although the Fugo balloons were primitive by modern standards, their strategic logic, using the environment itself as a weapon delivery system, was strikingly forward-looking. Today, the balloon bomb campaign is remembered primarily by historians, archaeologists, and local communities where remnants were found. Museums display fragments of paper envelopes, rusted bomb casings, and sandbags stamped with Japanese characters. These artifacts serve as quiet reminders that the Second World War reached even the most remote corners of North America in unexpected ways. The story of Japan's balloon bombs is not one of devastation or conquest, but of ingenuity, desperation, and unintended consequence. It is the story of a nation pushed to the limits of its resources, attempting to strike back across an ocean using wind, paper, and hydrogen. It is also the story of how information control, rather than firepower, rendered that attack largely meaningless. In the end, the Fugo campaign stands as the only time during World War II that the continental United States was directly attacked by enemy weapons, and one of the few times in military history when a weapon failed, not because it could not reach its target, but because no one was allowed to notice that it had.